Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're on chapter 24, verse 3. We left off yesterday with the question of the Kli Yakar. Avram says to Eliezer, don't take a wife for my son from the Canaanite women in the place in which I live. So the Kli Yakar asked the obvious question, don't we know by now that Avram lives in the land of Canaan? So, the Kli Yakar, first Kli Yakar on Pasuk Gimel, and he says that Avram is trying to address a very obvious question, which is the woman who they end up taking for Yitzchak. She doesn't come from a very pious family. Lavan and Besuel aren't so impressive. So what is it about Rivka's family that's better than the locals? So to this, the Kli Yakar says that Avram is explaining as follows. It's about 6 lines into the Kli Yakar on Pasuk Gimel. Alkein Amar Asher Anochi Yoshev B'Kirbo. So Avram says the issue is not the quality of the family here versus the quality of the family there. The issue is because I live here. V'Amar Penta Shivas B'ni Shama. He says, lest you send my son there. Ki Amar Pshita Im Yisa B'ni Isha Mibro Saknani. So what Avram's worried about, Avram basically knows that he's sort of one of a kind in terms of how his family lives. So if Yitzchak marries a local, so let's say assume Yitzchak decides to live near Avraham. So Avraham has equal influence on Yitzchak and his wife as Yitzchak's in-laws do. V'im Yisa mibnos Lavan u'Besuel v'yader etzlam azish gamkein lachush shemol yilmon b'maseh. And by the way, and if he would live in Rivka's land, for example, there'd be great concern that he'd be impacted by Lavan and Besuel. Avol kishigisa isha misham. But if he marries a woman from Avram's birthplace, v'yidor kan, but lives near Avraham, then everything will be okay. Because the point is, I'll be able to impact them alone, and Yitzchak's in-laws won't have much of an influence on them because they won't be living with them. So it's not as much that Avram is saying the people in my homeland are better than the people here. He's saying the people in my homeland are there, and the people here are here, and I'd like it to be that Yitzchak will marry someone who, of course, has to be an appropriate person, but I also want it to be that whatever influences from her family won't impact Yitzchak and his wife. So that's just interesting. Take it or leave it, but it's an interesting shot. Okay, let's jump ahead now to verse 22. Jumping ahead to verse 22. So Eliezer, famous thing, Eliezer asks God to help him. Eliezer gives a whole sign. He says, if a woman who comes forward and offers me a drink, and offers my camels to drink, that's the sign from you, God, that this is the right one. And right after he's finished saying this woman shows up, and she gives him to drink, and he's just amazed. So, verse 22, Vayihi kasher kilu hagmalim l'shtos, and it was when the camels finished drinking. The man took a golden ring, and 2 bracelets on her hands, and they had X amount of gold weight. So to say that he took 2 bracelets on her hands, you could understand it otherwise, but it sounds like it's saying Eliezer placed 2 bracelets on her hands. Now, verse 23, Vayomer bas miat. He said, who's your father? Hagidi nali. Please tell me. Hayesh beis avich makom lanu lalin. Does your father have a place for us to stay? So this is really strange because part of Avram's condition is that it be somebody from his family. So it's very nice that Eliezer set this sign up and asked God to help him, but the sign is fulfilled. Eliezer already puts jewelry on her, and he says afterwards, so by the way, who is your father? Maybe I should just find out. Now, she says who her father is, and it is a relative of Avram, so everything's good. But why is this the sequence? Shouldn't Eliezer first find out who her father is to see if this is the right one before he starts giving her the gifts? So let's see the Ramban on Pasuk Chaf Beis. Vayikacho ish nezem zahavu shnei tzmidim al yodea. This pasuk is omitting the act. Shomer should have said, we missed the phrase. It should have said, he took a nose ring, he placed it on her nose, and he placed bracelets on her hands, but it doesn't actively say that he put anything on her. It just sort of sounds like that's what it's saying. Just an interesting thing. So the Ramban says the pshat of the pasuk is not that he placed the jewelry on her. It's that he took out the jewelry that he was ready to give. He took out the nose ring, he took out the bracelets that could go on her hands, and he asked, "Who is your father?" Then someone as a malapa. After she gives the right answer, then he immediately gives her the jewelry. So the Ramban says, don't get too bothered by the sequence of the pasuk, because it doesn't say explicitly that he put the jewelry on her. He says all this pasuk means is that he had the jewelry ready. He was very excited he had the jewelry ready, but he hadn't given it to her yet. That's how the Ramban explains the pshat in the pasuk. Now let's just see the sforno u'shnei tzmidim al yodeha. It's the second sforno on this pasuk. He has a different shot in the pasuk. Ru'uyim lemidas yadeha. You know what it means when it says the two bracelets on her hands? It doesn't mean he placed the two bracelets on her hands. It means he took two bracelets that would fit her hands. Al yadeha, he says, means it fit her. It fit the size for her hands. So that's a different shot to get around this problem. But just for the record, look at Rashi on Pasuk Chav Gimel. Rashi on Pasuk Chav Gimel, Vayomer Bas V'yat, the first Rashi. La'achar shenasan la sho'ala. Says Rashi, like we were assuming the pshat in the pasuk was, after he gave her the jewelry, he said, "I guess I should ask you, who's your father?" Because he was sure, he was confident in the merit of Avram, that God would bring him success. So, according to Rashi, this was a done deal. But he understands there's a formality here just to follow Avram's instructions. But he knew what the answer was going to be. It was obvious to him what the answer was going to be, because he was so confident that God would answer his prayers in the merit of his master Avram. And whatever doubts he might have had, I mean, Rashi doesn't say this, but my gosh, right after he made the request, the sign that he was looking for happened right away. It's a pretty strong indicator that this is going the way he was hoping it to go. Okay. Another question. So we asked the question about the jewelry, and then he asks, who's your father? But back to that pasuk 23. So he asks, who's your father? He hasn't yet heard the answer. And he asks, do you have a place for me to stay? Now, just imagine for a second if her father is not from the right family. So is Eliezer going to want to stay there then? I mean, obviously, he wants to stay at the home of the family whom he's hoping to make a shidduch with. If this is not the right family, Eliezer's got more work to do. It's probably going to be awkward staying at this house of the family he's not interested in. So isn't this a little bit jumping the gun before he hears the answer of who her father is to ask, do you have a place for me to stay? Or Achayim on Pasuk Chav Gimel, Basmiat Hagidi, Samach Beis HaShe'elos. He adjoined these two questions: who's your father and do you have a place to stay? Lahagid, to teach. He lo nistapik imhim ibnei mishpachas Avram. Similar to what we saw in Rashi, he had no doubt that she was from Avram's family. Shimay Masupak lo haya lo lisho hayesh makom ad shiyada ad shiyedem derech nochel lefanav. Because he says the greatest proof that Eliezer was sure what the answer was going to be is that he already asked if you have a place for me to stay. He had absolute faith that God had brought him success. Umash shoal bas mi'at, hu mashem avia. V'kolim shutoshav amar yesh beis avich, ki lo nishtanet avzeh ba'agaras bas mi. Really interesting pshat. Dor HaChaim says his question was not for the purposes of ascertaining whether or not this is a shidduch he should make. He had no doubts. He was sure this person was related to Avram. He just had a technical question. Who's your father? I mean, I guess I should know. I'm sure it's someone related to Avram, but just for informational purposes, who's your father? So that's a very interesting way to understand. Plus, it's not the standard way to understand it. The standard way to understand it is, it could be like Rashi said, but it could also be like the Ramban and the Sforno both seem to say, which is that he's not sure that God has brought him the answer. He hopes God has brought him the answer, but he's still got to cross his T's and dot his I's. And are you related? Okay. Let's jump ahead now to verse 39. There's a very famous thing over here, the account. I mean, we're just seeing a pasuk here and a pasuk there, but the account of Eliezer's going on his journey and going to the place and his request of God to help him and his meeting Rivka, there's many psukim taken up on this account. And then she brings him to her family. And then Eliezer tells them the whole story. And whereas you might have assumed that the Torah would say Eliezer told them what happened, the Torah goes through the whole account, not exactly verbatim, but almost verbatim, all over again. And there's a famous question over here. The Medrash asks, why does he have to go through the whole thing again? And a famous Medrash, Rashi brings it down that it's to teach that the Torah is teaching us. There are so many halachos in the Torah that are only taught through a letter here, a word there, a hint here. And here we're going through this whole detailed conversation with Eliezer. And from that, we learned that there's more to learn from the servant of the patriarch, Eliezer, than from many of the basic halachos in the Torah. That's a very, very famous measure. Okay, now, in Eliezer's repetition of what occurred in verse 39, he's explaining the instructions that Avram gave him at the beginning. And Avram tells him, go to the land of my family and find a wife for my son there. And now verse 39, Va'omar al Adoni, and I said to my master, Ulai lo selei choisha acharoi. Perhaps the woman won't want to come with me. What happens then? Maybe she won't be interested. What then? Verse 40, Vayomer Eloi, Abraham responded, Hashem asher salachti fanav yishlach malacho itach v'yitzliach darkecha v'lakachto yishalavnim mishpachtim v'beis avi. He says, listen, God's going to bring you success. If for some reason you don't succeed, you're absolved of this oath that you're taking, but I don't want you to find a wife for my son from this neighborhood. But there's an interesting thing. Ulai, if you look, it's the fourth word in verse 39. Ulai means perhaps. Ulai is spelled without a vav. There normally would be a vav in between the aleph and the lamed, and it's spelled ulai. If the Baal Koreh isn't well prepared, if he reads that on Shabbos, he might read it as Eli. That wouldn't be the correct way to read it, but that's how the letters sound. That's how the letters look, excuse me. Eli means to me. Ulai lo sadei isha. Eli ksiv, says Rashi. It's spelled Eli to me. Bas haisalol Eliezer. Eliezer had a daughter. Medrash says that Eliezer was really hoping that Avram would say, well, if all else fails, I'd be happy for Yitzchak to marry your daughter. That's what he was hoping would happen. So he says, what happens if I go to that land and I can't find anybody appropriate? So it's maybe, just maybe. And so that's where the Medrash says he's hoping that it's him. Avram says back to him, B'ni Baruch v'ata arur. My son holds special blessings. This is carrying my legacy. You're a descendant of Canaan. It's the whole story with Noah. You're cursed, and it's not going to be a shidduch. We're going to talk more about this medrash tomorrow, God willing. So we discussed the Kli Yakar's perspective as to why Avram emphasizes, I don't want you to take a spouse from the place in which I'm living. We discussed the question of the fact that there's a pasuk that talks about Avram getting Eliezer providing the jewelry before he finds out her family tree. What was the story with that? We also discussed the questions Or HaChaim, where he asks, who's your father and can I stay at your house? And we left off with this Rashi about Ulai and Eli.